She will be presenting on Indigenous knowledge in occupational therapy and occupational science towards a decolonized curriculum. You can take this one.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending the presentation. I seem to have left my spectacles at home, so I need to be closer to the screen. So apologies for sitting while I'm doing the presentation. So why am I here? I'm an occupational therapist. Who am I? My name is Vaseline Adams. Who am I? My second. I'm an occupational therapist, and that's why I'm here. So let me start to tell you a little bit about occupational therapy. Occupational therapy is a client-centered health profession concerned with promoting health and well-being through occupation. And we define occupation a little bit different, but I'll get to it now. The primary goal of occupational therapy is to make it possible for people to participate in activities of everyday life. So we are making it possible for people to engage in activities that they would like to engage in and be able to do what they want to do. So how do we define occupations? Because we talk about occupations quite a lot. And occupations refer to everyday activities that people do as individuals, in families, and with communities to occupy time and bring meaning and purpose to life. Occupations include things that people need to do, want to do, and expected to do. And this is important that we understand the differences, because not everybody only do things that they want to do. There are forced occupations where people are forced into doing certain things that might not be in line with their needs or their culture. So it's very important that we think about that. And then occupational science is the science that is fundamental to occupational therapy. And occupational science is the study of how humans participate in occupations. Let's unpack a little bit more of this occupational that people engage in. And Rushan Khalfan talks about occupational choice. So what people do are influenced by two parts. The first part is personal factors, and the second part is contextual factors. And age plays a big role in what people do. So a child will do different occupations than an older person because of the child and who they are. A person's capabilities and disabilities will impact on what we do, or our occupational choices, our physical and mental health, and also our life goals, our interests will influence what we do, so our occupations. But also we've got the contextual side. So gender and sexuality and society's interpretation of what a female versus a male need to do will influence our occupations that we engage in, especially in South Africa, where we live in a very patriarchal society. Social, political, social, cultural, and socioeconomic factors in the context influence what people do, including the traditions and the traditional knowledge that influence their choices. In South Africa, we also need to consider our colonial past, apartheid, and the intergenerational cycle of poverty and oppression that impacts on the occupations or activities that people do daily. And of course, in the current situation, employment status, load shedding, increased cost of living all influence the choices people daily make of what they participate in and what they do. And it can influence it positively or negatively, depending on the person. Okay. So there's been a call for decolonization of the curriculum, especially the occupational science curriculum. That's why I had to define all of that. And the reason for this is because occupational therapy as well as occupational science both originated from the global north. Occupational therapy in itself originated in North America and Europe, while occupational science originated in the USA. The majority of our epistemology, singular, and ontology was generated in the global north. So there's one viewpoint in occupational therapy, and that's one of the issues. There are increased call for decolonizing occupational therapy curriculum, the models and the tools and theories that we are using, but not just from the global south, also from certain global northern countries that have indigenous populations like New Zealand and Australia. Ramagondo in 2015 and Shiman in 2017 highlighted the fact that there's a gap in research reporting on or about Indigenous communities and the influences of oppression on their occupational performance and choices. And Mugondo goes so far as to say that it's unstudied. It's not looked at. And then Santos in 2014 said that decoloniality includes learning from the global south. And this is what the rest of this presentation is about. Okay. But when we look at occupational therapy education and occupational science education, we also need to consider there was a study done in Ghana where they looked at decolonization of their curriculum, and they found that the foundation work or foundational knowledge that the students receive is largely very theoretical and based on global north areas of interest, with limited practical knowledge relevant to the local context. And that is one of the biggest issues that the student have highlighted. Theories like child development are based on Western research, and when it's taught to the students, they're not always taught the local differences. So students couldn't relate to the knowledge they are given, as it is so different from what they know. And this is one of the reasons that students had to resort to rote learning, rather than just understanding what the information that they are getting. So there's not enough, they identified that there's not enough inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. And currently, the situation that we've got in South Africa is there's not a singular term for occupational therapy in any of the Indigenous languages in South Africa. So for me, that is also a big issue. So changes is thus needed. So factors that we need to consider in the process of decolonizing this curriculum. So changes are needed, but we need to consider various things. And while unpacking these considerations, I will also highlight questions that we need to explore while we're trying to find answers. So the first consideration that we need to look at is contextual relevance. We talk about the global south, but we know that the global south is very diverse. I'm not sure what's happening there. I've got a different slide. So the global south is very diverse. And that's why it's important not just to talk about the global south, but also to talk about contextual relevance. And this is why I'm at this conference, because contextual relevance for me means inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. And this is one of the main reasons that I am at this conference. To understand what Indigenous knowledge systems are all about and how it can guide us to respond to calls to broaden our knowledge base on occupational performance, especially of marginalized groups, which is needed in Africa and South Africa. So the question is, how do we gather knowledge needed, and how do we ensure that it's not gathered through a colonial lens? Thus, when we interpret and analyze what we are seeing, how do we ensure that it's not done through our colonial lenses that we have already? But I'll get to that now. The second consideration as we move to contextual relevance is who should be involved. So there's a bias or a dilemma that we are facing. Who should lead the process, or who should be included in the process of inclusion of Indigenous knowledge into the curriculum? Shiman, that wrote a very beautiful article about olive growing in Palestine and the occupation and the impact it has on the occupations. When she reflected on her training at a Western university, she said that the university has adopted a very Western perspective and Western epistemology, and she said this is an example of theoretical imperialism, whereby knowledge is created by scholars in the West who base their knowledge on taken for granted ontology and epistemologies, is incorrectly thought to be universal and applicable for global communities. And this thought that it is universal is what we want to address, that it is not universal, which means now we need to look at how can we bring other knowledge to the forefront as well in occupational therapy. In South Africa, many of the current lecturers and researchers were educated in this system where the majority of the content is from the global north. So bearing in mind Frantz Fanon's writing on the colonized mind, the question for me is what could the lectures and the researchers' mind in part be colonized already? So previously when I talked about who should lead this, it can't be the lectures, because the lectures, I consider myself colonized in the information that I have already, because I was taught information from the global north. And for me, it's almost a second nature to think of that information as well. So if I interpret information that I'm getting, how do I make sure that I'm not interpreting it through a colonized lens? And then, of course, the other question that we need to consider, who should be involved? Community. So Radman, who looked at how to prepare Australian occupational therapists to decolonize its practice, found that said that community members and community elders should be involved. And then, of course, for us, the question in South Africa is, with so many different ethnic and indigenous groupings, who should be involved? How do we know, who do we partner with? From the university, I'm from the University of Stellenbosch. Should we look at which are the groups, the indigenous groups within the Western Cape, where we are now, or should we look at from which communities our students come? Our students come from other communities in South Africa as well, besides the Western Cape. So whose knowledge, beliefs, traditions and values should we consider? The healthcare users or the healthcare providers, or both? Consideration 2 still, students should be co-researchers and co-curriculum developers for occupational science curriculum. But the other question that we need to consider is which students are the best situated to contribute here. At many universities, occupational science are taught in the first year, but our first years experience enough to separate the book knowledge from their indigenous and lived experiences as well. And would a student in a later year be much more much more able to engage and to be a co-curriculum developer and co-researcher. And then in occupational therapy education, the majority of our students are white, from middle socioeconomic students, and many of these students are coming from urban environments. So we also need to consider the knowledge that they are bringing, and would it be very different from what we are seeing at the moment within the global north. And then the third consideration is the majority of what is written in the literature is written by authors from the global north. So the question is, what are the contributions to occupational science literature from authors from low and middle income countries, so that we can get the voices from authors from the global south as well? This we want to do through a scoping review. But we need to, however, it's not just about, as Prof. Sahalo said, it's not just around the content from low and middle income countries, but we also need to look at how this knowledge was created and critically review who contribute to the knowledge creation, and whether it's not just a regurgitation of knowledge that was created within the global north. And then, of course, the other thing that we need to consider is what Prof. Wally was talking about, extraction research, and making sure that when we are gathering information and forming partners with indigenous people to create or to influence the curriculum, that it's not just us going in, getting the information, and then moving out again, that we actually build sustainable partnerships that's mutually beneficial for all of us. So that's another point that we need to consider. So in summary, I've highlighted many of the questions that we need to consider when considering indigenous knowledge as part of the decolonization of the occupational science curriculum. However, we don't have answers yet, and planning the process to decolonize the curriculum is still a work in progress. So the question is, how should we reimagine occupational science knowledge? Any help, advice, guidance would greatly be appreciated. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Fasloon, for that stimulating presentation, for helping us, I guess, think through and towards what a decolonial or decolonized occupational therapy might look like, and for also raising several questions. I will open up to the room for Sure, I'll give this to you. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. My comment is that I have such a hatred for occupational therapy because at some point, yes, because at some point my son had to go through occupational therapy from the lower grades, grade O, 5 O's before he got to grade R, if I could put it that way. And I think I hate it. It was the approach, I think, from the school. I just felt ambushed by the process. I couldn't fully grasp why he needed to go through that process. So yeah, that's my comment. It's just, it made me hate it. And then eventually I had to resist and do my own occupational therapy in a way. Yeah.
That is that occupational therapy, as I say, is very much based in Western philosophies, but it's also very much based in this medical model focus, you know, as in community, people's values, traditions are not always considered. And this is where occupational science and the voice of the voice, the values and the traditions that is relevant to the context, but from the global south, is needed to influence what we do, how we do it, and how we engage with people. Because if we're not going to do that, then we're never going to move to where it's accessible for everybody. Then it's only going to be accessible for a few privileged people. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at some point I also understood why he had to go through it. But I think, again, if they consider where we were coming from and whatever issues we had, even at home, just the ecology of the home, I think it would have made sense to me. But the approach was like, oh, well, we just think he should go through it and you have to pay 100,000 rand.
And occupational therapy in the past used to do for you and not with you.
Yeah.
And that is all part of what needs to change.
Yeah, definitely.
And that is all part of why we need to understand the values, the situations, and all of that, and be part of the community. But it's also why the face of occupational therapy needs to change. It shouldn't just be our white middle class students that is coming for occupational therapy. We need to change the face of occupational therapy as well. So lots of work is needed, and this is the beginning.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Fasloon. I will hand over now to Alvin Riffel, and he will be presenting on integrating Indigenous knowledge into pre-service teacher training, a pathway to culturally responsive education in South African universities. You may have a seat. Can I assist you?
Okay, just... good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Hope your lunch was as good as mine. I'm Alvin. I'm from the local university, one of the local universities in Cape Town or Bellville. It's University of the Western Cape. I am a lecturer. and also a researcher very profound of Indigenous knowledge. I do teach fourth years, pre-service teachers. I do teach third year and fourth year social sciences students, so it's geography and history. And then also first years. This year I had about 550 first year students. And it actually made me realize that how diverse the classroom setting is. And after a few baseline assessment tasks, it came to mind that I need to do something that was up in my head for the past 10 years. Is basically to design a resource book from first year level to introduce our students to Indigenous knowledge. There's such a vast pockets of knowledge that are undocumented. And I've been traveling to African countries since 2005, and I just stumbled across loads and loads and loads of undocumented IKS. And that's now from, I could say, from beliefs till metaphysical, weather-related, it's agricultural, it's hearsay knowledge, it's Sangoma knowledge, it's black magic knowledge. It's my professor said to me, Alvin, just don't go deeper, because you're going to find something that you won't like. And that's the black magic, the cultural, deep-rooted knowledge. That's also IKS. I stumbled across medicinal knowledge, herbal knowledge. I've stumbled across religious knowledge, Muslim knowledge, related to weather, meteorological science. So I've came to the conclusion that as a university lecturer and researcher, I must do something about it. And I must get a few people on board. I must apply for NRF funding, which was approved, to integrate Indigenous knowledge into pre-service teacher training. Because those are the teachers that are dealing with brilliant, young, bright minds, but they're almost lost in the sense of they're not grounded to beliefs. And with this Gen Z new type of generation teachers that we're pushing out, is almost that they want to say that's old school. You're too much of a believer in traditional things. We, the new generation, with the fast line of instant gratification. If they send you a WhatsApp, they need a immediate response. And I'm not that kind of guy. I'm an old school guy. So this presentation will explore the crucial role of Indigenous knowledge, as I've stated in the opening presentation slide, that South African universities, and I think we can include also colleges and places of tertiary institutions. I don't know why I keep on using the word universities. It maybe sounds smart and nice. But I'm including all tertiary institutions, TVET colleges, Boston colleges, Menkosa, Stadio, all those, Cornerstone, all those institutions that are privately nested even. And it was with this importance that we need to look at culturally responsive pedagogy in the classroom. And I'm specifically speaking about teacher training. The teachers that we produce, that exit our universities, must be able to speak and bring in IKS. IKS is not or do not want to be integrated into science. It's a type of knowledge that can stand on its own 2 feet. It's a kind of knowledge. I've listened to Prof's keynote address of the umbilical cord, and I'm one of those in my colored community. Sorry, pardon the pun for the racial term that I use, but it's an apartheid term. We were coined as coloreds, non-whites or blacks, Indians. And as a colored boy, my umbilical cord, Prof, is in the yard where I grew up. And that's my roots, and that's my dignity. So IKS is very culturally sensitive. And you can imagine if a colored, sorry for the term, a person of color, stand in front of a class and depict on certain knowledges that he can't describe. It's almost as a smack in the face of those that are listening to him. So our teachers must be trained, and they must be guided how to unpack this. Next slide, please. So we at a conference where this was defined, what indigenous knowledge is. We know there's a traditional side of things. There's an oral side of things. We've listened to the Maria Makeba poem early this morning that are flung in New York, the streets of New York, the corner shops. There's oral traditional value in it. There's a spiritual belief. I'm a qualified meteorologist. I'm a weatherman. So I've got my first 2 degrees in weather predictions. And I use that backbone knowledge of meteorology to just go and look what is available in our communities related to weather, forecasting, indigenous-wise. And I think if I made an example that comes to mind, you would have heard Oma or Gogo say, "Oh, my knee is paining, it's going to rain tomorrow." Have you ever heard that? That's physiological. That's physiologically of nature. And that's a IKS weather indicator. And grandma and grandpa, as much as we want to prove them wrong, they were right. And eventually it would start rain within the next 6 to 12 hours. And I even set up, because the nature of my studies is to design software, to build weather stations, things like these, that stand on tripods. It's got weather vanes and weather cups, and it can sense temperature. And I overheard Prof said it's 10 degrees, and immediately it gives me a digital connection to how we feel. Our skin is sensitive, so she can make a scientific prediction on how cold it is. One of the students came in and said, "Wow, it is 9 degrees. So, Prof, you were very close." Yes. So that's an embedded piece of knowledge that is floating amongst us at the round tables, at conferences, but we're not so aware of it. Next slide, please. So we need to do, there's a huge challenge in pre-service training. You can imagine 500 students. This fly is also within this presentation. So the challenges with pre-service teacher training is, you can imagine 500 first-year students coming from all 4 corners of the globe in one lecture room, and a few of them are in line or in touch with their cultural belief roots, because those knowledges were seen as taboo. And we're sitting on, as far as my research go back, on approximately 600 to 1,000 years of indigenous knowledge that are undocumented. It's not found in university shelves. It's not in this line of tertiary institution or knowledge creation. So there's a huge challenge that we're sitting with, that we need to contribute. I'm going to go faster through the presentation. There's a huge curriculum biasness. With this new Bella Act that came out, it almost sidelined the CAPS document, the Curriculum Assessment Policy Statement of DBE, the Department of Basic Education. It almost, indigenous knowledge is just a word, but it doesn't give the essence of how indigenous knowledge must be incorporated into the classroom, the training that involves teachers. So my job is to force the university to just go to the previous slide, please, to do this in terms of respect for diversity in the classroom. So there's a huge amount of lack of educators limited exposure of indigenous systems. If we speak about it, it's almost as your audience doesn't know. So we need to bring that into the forefront, and it must be tapped into the school curriculum, into policies, so that that lack of indigenous recognition, whether it's language, whether it's culture, that we must speak frequently about it. And I had during my PhD research, I sort of invited a few teachers as far as Bloemfontein, Beaufort West, to come to the university and share their experience. And we found that it was a huge lack amongst our teachers. And those teachers are in the system for more than 25, 30 years. So you can imagine how many students went through their classrooms without talking about this IKS thing. Next slide, please. So we have a cultural responsive pedagogy that we need to train. We need to get this into our being as knowledge creators. We need to have a sense of respect when we bring it into the classroom. We need to have an indigenous perspective. How much and for what reasons we're bringing it into the classroom. Because exploring the IKS world opens up a lot. There's a lot that we're going to unearth. Community engagement. Community engagement. I want elderly people in my community to come to the classroom, to engage with the youngsters, to teach them about the umbilical cord, to teach them about the physiological pain, to teach them about the birds, the bees in the field, the animals that carries a huge amount of this IKS. Next slide, please. So there are strategies that I need to tackle ahead of this development of this resource book. That's the main reason why I'm here. I'm collecting telephone numbers. I'm walking past people and I'm taking my cell phone and I'm taking pictures of these cards. And I just asked the person, just give me your cell phone so I can connect with you, because I would at the end of the day need this platform to promote, because we need to develop a curriculum for IKS to take it into the classroom. We need to have certain instructional approaches. The Piagets, the Vygotskis, the Bronfenbrenners, the scaffolding, the Jerome Berners, the Bloomsburg theories, all of those need, it's Western worldviews, but we can capitalize on it. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So we need to have a proper instructional approach how to take this into the classroom. I can give you an example of weather research. I spoke to a few elderly people up in Mpumalanga, up north, Hazyview. I used the word lightning, and they said, please don't talk about lightning, because lightning is something else. Where are you from? I said, I'm from the university, I'm doing research, Gogo. She said, don't come into my hut, because you're going to bring that lightning is going to strike my hut. So there's a great belief that we need to train teachers the proper way. And we need to collaborate with partners outside the universities, outside our knowledge capacities. We are professors, doctors, and institutional people that take charge. We need to take this thing into our communities and unearth and come back, put it on paper, and document it into what I call a resource book. Next one, please. Next slide. So in engaging with indigenous communities will give us a sense of knowledge sharing. We will, at the end of the day, come up with collaborative curriculum development where nobody is left out behind. Community-based learning experience, we will pick up from this person, that how to deal with this, because I grew up as a colored child. What's good for me and what's to value of me, it's a different take to my next door neighbor. Next slide, please. So addressing institutional barriers, this is what I'm struggling with. There are old policies, 20 years old, that do not allow me, I've got 1 minute, that does not allow me and even my colleagues and peers to change the rule of thumb, because those policies are guiding the Western worldview, the capitalism, the economic train, the gravy train that all of them are on. So they're not going to allow us easily access to change those documents. Look at the Bala Bill. It changes the directory of what free and fair and open education should be. If you go read the Bala Bill, there's a lot of entities that doesn't speak freely. And then faculty development. There's a lot of people that hang on. They are in their comfort zone. They do research. They've got funding. It's only being spent on them. And I'm not going to allow Riffle to tap into that, because that's my funding. The bureaucracy, the bulldozing effect. So resource allocation, we need to open up that avenue as IKS stakeholders. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, next slide. In conclusion, I want to call up onto my fellow peers in the IKS arena, in this realm where we are at this international fourth conference is, connect with me so I can integrate into pre-service teacher training. I've got the voice that I can bring it into first year classroom, third year classroom, and fourth year classroom to build this curriculum transformation. I need your assistance to tackle this approach and empower future educators to create a learning environment that can be of value and that we can all celebrate, that diversity that we are here for, that we all are here for. So curriculum transformation, think about it. If you in curriculum development, speak to me. If you're in community collaboration, if you're a global partner, a person that travels internationally, we as international guests that I want to connect with, my relations, the internationalization relations office at the university, we can set up a MOU, a memorandum of understanding. We can create teacher mobility. I've got a few of those that I'm teaching to Spain. I've got a Prof. Vicente Ballesteros that I'm running a 3-year partnership with. I'm exchanging my master's student or PhD students to Spain. They spend 4 months. So I want that kind of collaboration that are worthy to transform education into the right direction. People, I'm going to leave it here. Speak to me. I'm going to be around today and tomorrow. Thank you, Jade Morkel, for allowing me that extra few minutes.
Thank you so much, Alvin. What I will do is I will open for one question or comment, if anyone has any. Sure, Dave. Okay, you got it. Is that one on?
Thank you, Elder, for those words. Mine is not necessarily a question. It's a comment that I'm not sure where it's directed, but to just also appreciate and sparked by the thought of how we tend to understand the weather. From the Eastern Cape, there's a tendency of when there's a great storm coming that we can see from the clouds. They call it umhlekazi, which is maybe colloquially, translated as a sir or a gentleman, one of prestige. That's what they call the storm. And only mothers will get out with pots and everything and just beat and make noises. And then it will go, because that's what they're trying to do. They're sending it to wherever it's directed and not pass by our houses. And we do not understand where that comes from or why or who thought of that. And us, who are township boys, we always laugh at that thing. But it actually does happen. And there's a poem we read in high school. That was very many years ago. I forgot who wrote it. And it just spoke around how it says that labo bonakala mhlamnene ukuba laligquthile enzahla ngokuhle inkonjane yangazixela umsindo zayo, saying that the sky just became promising a storm, a very great storm. And then intoni inkonjane kanene in English, inkonjane is a bird, but I forgot what kind of a bird it is. And then the birds were just soulless. They were just restless in the sky. And they were speaking about colonialism, or when in the 1652s the sky could feel that the whites are coming and they are not bringing anything that is beautiful to that. That's what they wrote about. So that's the thought that sparked. Thank you very much.
I think I would invite you to speak to me afterwards, because there's a lot that I've uncovered, a lot. I'm just going to give you one example of the low-cost housing in Khayelitsha and the other low-cost areas. They call it a hockey. You know, it's a hockey. No? It's a shanty. So you'll see on the shanty there's tires, motor car tires on top. And then sometimes deeply, if you go deeper, you would see somebody would put an aloe vera plant in their tire with inside on the hockey or the rondavel. That is weather related. It keeps the lightning away, and it's scientifically proven if the lightning hits the shanty, it would create a buffer, it would disperse the bolt, the strength, and therefore you would never heard in a newspaper or any article that a shanty caught fire related to lightning in the Western Cape or even in any other parts, because that's the belief. If they put a tire on top of the roof, it's not to keep the roof down from blowing off. It's because that indigenous knowledge came from far, far deep down to disperse the lightning. And there's a lot of others that I can, but I think we need a whole afternoon and another day or two to speak about what. So I would invite you to come and speak to me afterwards. If you see me around, I would be very glad to entertain it.
Thank you. That's an open invitation, colleagues. And next time you come, you'll tell us more about decolonizing meteorology. Okay, we will move on swiftly to Tanvi. Tanvi will talk to us about the promotion of indigenous knowledge in the Global South, perspectives from Indo-Africa.
A very warm good afternoon to one and all, and thank you for giving this opportunity of presenting my paper titled Promotion of Indigenous Knowledge in Global South, Perspectives from Indo-Africa. So in a nutshell, this paper is about how the similarities between India and South Africa exist, particularly with respect to the education sector, and how the education sector policies are looking into the aspect of indigenous knowledge. So we all know since time immemorial, the indigenous communities have existed across the globe with their own set of knowledge and cosmology about the environment, which hasn't received much appreciation and recognition from the mainstream due to the fact that their roots lie outside the formal system. However, in the current times, we can see there is a growing currency about the term of indigenous knowledge in not only academia, but also the global market. So this comes in the backdrop of the rising multidimensional inequalities across the countries. The IKS and its associated practice constitutes an important driving force for the attainment of sustainable development. As we are living in the UN declared indigenous language decade, it becomes, okay, yeah, thank you. It is essential to understand indigenous knowledges and practices not as static, solely traditional, but as dynamic, innovative, that continues to challenge the various colonial influences. So this comes with a brief background about like there exist two knowledge systems, the Eurocentric and the indigenous. So is it the complete division between the two, or can we integrate? So according to NOF, the IKSP has suffered relegance at the behest of colonial and neo-colonial knowledge structures that has treated the structures and knowledge of indigenous communities as inferior. The same kind of argument can be found in another statement by Kovac, where there exists a distinction between Western and indigenous knowledge system. So this clear-cut distinction is about like the Western knowledge usually fragments and compartmentalize the world and its issues. However, the indigenous knowledge is all about seeing it in a holistic approach. So if we look into the approach, the Western can be called as a reductionist, where there is compartmentalization, while the indigenous knowledge system is more of inclusionary process. So in the recent decade, there is a vocalization of epistemic justice through native scholars as well as non-native scholars. So the main concern it is not indigenous knowledge does not necessarily require scholarship only from the natives, but it also can be from the non-natives. However, they should have a same kind of aim. The aim should be to help expose and overcome the Eurocentric hegemonies in Western societies, discourses, and knowledge systems. So, in all, apart from the Eurocentrism discourse, the another aspect related to indigenous knowledge is also about coloniality and decoloniality. So, since this paper is from Indo-African perspective, I'll just give a quick brief about India and Africa with regards to their experience in, of coloniality. Yeah. With respect to the education sector, if we see in both South Africa and India, there has been structural exploitation in both the countries. Both have suffered at the hands of colonial process. So the same situation, if we look into the comparison of India and South Africa, so we can see the same situation holds true for India also, where the British colonial structures subjugated the rich multicultural life of Indian communities through the power of language, knowledge, and resources. So during colonial periods, we can see the education. Education was designed to uphold apartheid in Africa through the creation of separate rudimentary schooling for indigenous people and secondary schooling for white and assimilated colonials. In the similar fashion, Indian education system of colonial days symbolized a process of assimilating the privileged class and caste via the wave of Englishization, with the wave of Englishization, while the underprivileged, mostly indigenous tribes and natives remained aloof from the access. Therefore, the indigenous knowledge system of both the countries have been disrupted by a Western model that has disregarded the native languages in the name of modernization. So, the objective of this study I already mentioned. It is kind of a descriptive paper, and it's a work in process. Okay, yeah. So let us go through how India and South Africa in the post-colonial period, with respect to the constitution, how they share similar values. Okay, this is, it's working here, it's not coming, oh yeah, it's there. So both India and South Africa have adopted a written constitution. While Indian constitution was enacted in 1950, South Africa was the year 1996. So if we look into the preamble of both the countries, it starts with the wordings, "We the people," meaning people are sovereign, and the constitution draws its authority from the people of. Likewise, both the constitutions have a framework of rights in the name of fundamental rights and Bill of Rights. Next, both the constitution also looks into the aspects of social justice and prevention of discrimination, and seeks to address and contain provisions for affirmative action and protection of the marginalized groups. Therefore, constitutional pillars of democracy, social justice, non-racism, dignity underpins values upon which the educational policies of both the countries is premised. So India and South Africa both act as a storehouse of indigenous knowledge. So let us look into some of the policies' vision on how the indigenous knowledge has been termed with respect to these policies and acts. So the first comes the latest national education policy of India. It proposes a revision of all aspects of education while building upon India's traditions and value systems. The policy vision is to instill among learners a deep-rooted pride in being Indian, not only in thought, but also in spirit, intellect, deeds, as well as to develop knowledge, skills, values, dispositions that support responsible commitment to human rights and sustainable living. The policy inscribes particularly the Indian knowledge system and other ways of learning should be covered within the curriculum and the various disciplines such as mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, yoga, linguistics, sports, etc. An engaging course on the indigenous knowledge systems will also be available in the secondary schools. Likewise, in the higher education, if we see at present, there are 50 universities and 500 colleges that are having the programs run on indigenous knowledge. So coming to on similar tones, coming to South Africa National Education Policy, its directive principle states each individual has an equitable access to the institutions of learning, which is accompanied with the right to language and education integration. So over here we can see in the policy statements itself how the constitutional principles are part of the policies. So the next is the South Africa Indigenous Knowledge Policy that aims to recognize, affirm, and protect the indigenous knowledge in South Africa for promoting promoting understanding and well-being. It also states the laws of copyright, designs, trademark, and geographical indications may be used to protect the indigenous cultures. Designs unique to South Africa, for example, could be protected using the laws of design. Thus, indigenous knowledge through this policy is legally protected in education sector. Several authors have also pointed to the integration of IKS policy into higher education. The National Manifesto of Values of Education strengthened the constitutional principles by establishing values of accountability, rule of law, respect, among others. So if all the policies are saying good and are having the principles, then why there are still governance issues and what are the roadblocks? So these are some of the points between India and South Africa that share similarity in terms of executing the policy visions. So the first is the South Africa, where despite high spending on education, the country is still faced with poor outcomes and high inequality rates. So similar kind of inequality also exists in India. However, inequality's pattern is different. Like in India, grapples with regional and linguistic and other identity-based divides. The second point is lack of resources. So with respect to the promotion of indigenous knowledge, not all the universities and the schools are equally funded. That we have also discussed in the previous sessions about the budget cuts. The third is about the contemporary, this is a new thing that is coming up. In higher education, in both the countries, they're catering to kind of a colonial education system, which is now boxed in a new packaging of promotion of multilingualism and internationalization. So it is just like attending to the new liberal models of education rather than devising any native kind of pattern. If we see into the teaching methods, like the medium of instruction, English still dominates. That relegates the opportunity for other languages, especially the indigenous language, to come to the fore. There is also a shift due to globalization and attention to prominent numerical languages. In terms like, if we look into the linguistic survey and the UNESCO World Atlas, so in India there are 197 languages that are endangered. And likewise, we can see in South Africa also there are particular languages that are critically endangered. So we also need to factor in the process of the neoliberalism that is affecting the education sector. Next comes in terms of organizing events. If we look into the languages, mostly English. So although English is lingua franca and it is the de facto use in all the events, but it also somewhere somehow not give equal opportunity in that sense to other languages. So another issue that relates to in both the countries is about inadequate teacher training. So not all teachers are aptly trained in the terms of skills also to impart the indigenous knowledge to various kind of students who are coming from different backgrounds and in different disciplines. Then there comes with if we see in India, the indigenous knowledge research is maybe concentrated on certain disciplines like mathematics, agriculture, that is serving the needs of the market rather than other disciplines. So that's the last point also, how the indigenous education is connected with knowledge. If the education sector is providing the theories, the disciplines, and the various kind of courses, so what is the employability of these courses? Will the students be absorbed in the labor market or not? So it's still a work in progress. I'm working on the hard data, finding the hard data between India and South Africa and other countries also. So I'll just quickly sum up. So despite we can see India and South Africa, despite their variation in geographies and historical legacies, both are similar in terms of their constitutional principles and also in their democratic education system. So it's just like there is a variation in terms of frequency, intensity, but the common problems are there. The implementation challenges exist in both the countries in terms of introducing multi-language learning, foundational skills development, value-based education that requires a thorough re-examination of teaching methods. So if we look into the policies, vision, definitions, provisions, they all testify IKSP relevance requiring deeper engagement, and the educational institutions can involve themselves in experimenting with the inclusive strategies rather than just inscribing the indigenous knowledge as a term in the policy statement. No, it's more about like how to go about it. What is the strategy? What are the realities on ground? So the institutions themselves can channelize and give new meaning to the policy visions. So yeah, the last point comes to this, that the incorporation of indigenous knowledge in the policy document itself showcase a movement from the examples of India and South Africa, that there is a movement of decolonizing global South in terms of language, provisioning, that ways. Yeah, that's a quick. Hope I'm under the time. I just rushed it.
Thank you so much for that, Tanvi. I think you pointed out some important connections between India and South Africa and how both those contexts incorporate IKS into its educational systems, but also some existing challenges. I will open up to the room for one or two comments or questions. Jenna, over there.
Thank you for that presentation. A very nice comparison. But of concern is the amount of roadblocks that there are. And of course, the concern is how do we overcome all of these roadblocks? But one of my other questions is around the multi-language learning. And in South Africa, we have, as you say, in India, you've got over 190 something. And in South Africa, we also have a lot of different languages, but we don't always have the teachers to teach in those languages, especially for all the subjects. So you might have teachers, maths teachers that might not teach in all the languages, or there might not be a maths teacher available. How can those be overcome? Yeah, in terms of their blocks.
Okay, in terms of multilingualism, if we talk about like the various subjects, you're particularly asking for South Africa or like in both the in general. So like there are provisions in terms of like promotion of regional languages, but also to incorporate that is a problem. It is still problematic. It is not something that can be resolved overnight, because it's a whole chain. Like you have to undergo the education first, in the programs itself, enroll yourself, get the requisite qualifications, then come to that. So in case you're not enrolling in a particular kind of language and the different regional languages, then it automatically builds up that chain, and the shortage will be there. So that is still there, and hopefully I don't have a concrete answer right now. I'll be very blunt. But anyhow, I'll look into it, and maybe we can get back on it. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanvi. I will now move on to Gretchen Duplessis, and she will speak to us about anti-abyssal research education.
Colleagues, do I have your permission to sit down in my presentation? Thank you very much. I'm very intimidated. Thank you for allowing me to dwell in this space with you and share with you ideas that are in my heart. This paper lived with me for quite a bit, and I hope to share my ideas as to why I call this anti-abyssal research training. So our Social Development Goal 4 aims to ensure that we give inclusive, equitable, quality education, and our higher education institutions respond to that call, but they also have the other call, the goal to offer such research training in a post-abyssal way. And I think that the research and the research training nexus, as they play themselves out in universities, are far more complex and often in competition with one another. Research and training for research is differently incentivized, it is differently built up, and we feel those tensions. And I think this is what I would like to convey as somebody who is tasked with training students in methodologies, how these things sometimes create tensions and dilemmas for one another. And then I ask myself sometimes, how much space can I and my student fight for to allow for actual epistemic disobedience, to do against the grain research? Will they find themselves in difficulties as they go along when other teams adjudicate their work? Can they truly do what we want them to do, is risk imagining an entirely different relationship between knowledge and reality? And I offer some attempts that I tried in a fourth year course after I've learned from my students, after I've done alongside traveling with them and heard from them what their needs and their views are, that I tried to do, and it's all still very tentative. So our Social Development Goal 4 tasks us as with lecturers in the higher education field to prepare and foster innovative future change makers. And in doing so, in that research training nexus that I say is a dilemma and pull in different directions often, we can find that as a lecturer, I need to cover an enormous ground of methodology, but do so in a way that's not so dry and boring, that I do not create a love and an enthusiasm for new research. Why did I call this anti-abyssal? Sorry, it's not moving. There we go. Now there are fantastic points that inspired this that I wanted to share, and that was the inspirational part was learning from my students, asking them how they regarded research and being co-creators of knowledge and learning from them. Then there are the pain points, and those pain points are that sometimes we are also dealing with self-doubt, how much epistemic disobedience is allowed. Often we fall back into template-like reactions to students' work. I always have a very fun conversation with a particular male colleague of mine who always wants to ask another scholar, but what is your theory? What is your methodology? What is your worldview? And my own reaction to that is, but all of this is emergent and changing. And I thought maybe our students find themselves in a similar position where they don't want to be pigeonholed yet. They want to be in that zone of becoming. And then there were two recent meetings that also created pain points. One in which a colleague, frustrated with the level of research, uttered the statement, but maybe the students struggle because we don't get the best students. And I was so shocked by it because I thought it's so easy in the neoliberal institution to redraw the abyssal line and to externalize an idea of deficit. We do get the best students. The challenge is up to us. And then there was a research ethics meeting where I felt everybody was so rushed to get a job through and to do it in a deadline, and they were talking past one another. So I think that abyssal line gets redrawn without us always realizing. So of course, the abyssal line comes from De Sousa Santos's idea that everything up to the abyssal line is accepted and hegemonic. Anything beyond that, that's non-Western epistemologies, then becomes trivialized, unaccepted, completely obliterated. And as I said, that hegemonic abyssal line is very deeply entrenched. It comes back when we're in a stressful situation. We often fall back on things that worked. And it comes back when there's massification and excessive workloads, when we don't understand the true complexity of that research training nexus, when we deal with our own self-doubts. And just at that moment when I thought I got it with a group of fourth-year students, where they came to the class and to the methodology with their own voice and their own understanding, I had this dreadful intrusion of AI again, that to me can create a new kind of cyber proletarization if we're not careful. So I learned from my students. I asked them, I sat down with a group of 207 fourth-year students and asked them, how do you see research? And it was so humbling and so eye-opening to me, and it's a process still. How do they make meaning of the research training nexus? Now, these students said to me, I just want to get through my methodology course and obtain a good mark, because this is merely a stepping stone into the masters. All right. And hegemonic practices, I think, gets repeated in spaces where we have that. The students were socialized into understanding their research methodologies as being in compartments. I'm either a qualitative or a quantitative or a mixed methods one. I'm not going to travel across these compartments at all. There was a lot of internalized deficit thinking. I'm not going to get this course. I don't want to become a quantitative researcher because I don't have good numerical skills. There was a lot of internalized deficit thinking that we had to clarify and get beyond. There was a lot of performity. There's a discourse that I need to master. Students hear of Earl Babby as being the textbook, which is again a Western hegemony, and it becomes Barbie. I quote Barbie a lot. Or they stumble on the idea in the more participatory kinds of methodologies of positionality, and then every second word is my positionality. So there's performance around this discourse that doesn't go deeper unless we sit down and we discuss. Shocking to me was that none of the students, when I asked them, mentioned that any of the research tasks that they did up to the methodology course was research. They didn't see it as co-creating knowledge. They saw it as something different. Only 5 out of the 207 students have ever read work that was not prescribed work, that was actually work produced by African scholars. So how did I start to address it? Through scenario-based teaching, by slowing down the pace and allowing for embodied learning, and for incorporating ideas of relational thinking and IKS andragogy. In terms of scenario-based teaching, my slides are not moving. Oh, there we go. In terms of scenario-based training, it is important to then take to the classroom works by African scholars addressing African things. Some of the authors that we discussed are in this room, so hence my great trepidation to talk about this. But this is what we found. They could see themselves in the works of African scholars that goes beyond the hegemony of Earl Babby and John Cresswell. They were reassured in online sessions where we just provided scaffolding, but we had double loop training in which they could discuss this, which they could say how I would do this differently if I had to do it in my way. What would work, what would not work? So slowly but surely they started to see themselves as competent, capable, and engaged knowledge creators. We need to slow down the pace. My school director, I acknowledge you. You know I talk about slowing down the pace quite a bit. And I think we all need to understand that time is that resource that is absolutely colonized. Sorry, can I move to the next slide? There we go. That's absolutely colonized within the neoliberal institution. We take our time and we predict, we commodify it, we govern it, we reward it. Sometimes it's seen as redundant time. We talk about hard deadlines nowadays. I see the call for papers all talk about hard deadlines and due dates and compliance and grants accumulations. And our time is instantaneous. That student who says, but why haven't you replied to my email? Like, it's got to be there instantaneously. There is also timeless time. We work all the time. So we take this and we redraw the abyssal line by telling students that all they need to become is a self-enterprising individual who spends most of the resources, their energy, their time, into human capital building only. And that is not the kind of scholar that we want to deliver. It's not this kind of scholar who would get to the kind of community engagement that we heard just before lunchtime. I'm rushing through my slides. This segues into the idea that we need to have embodied methodologies. We do research with our bodies, through our bodies. We hear, we react to others with our bodies. And I think the absolute pinnacle of epistemicide happened when there is the delegitimization of the mind, body, spirit unity of being. And I see how seamlessly we bring in the monastic scholarship into online classes again, where we tell everybody to mute, to listen to the lecturer and then speak. When I tell my students don't mute, I can hear that they're actually listening to the class or participating in the class while being on public transport. With children saying, "Mommy, I'm hungry," with a husband or a partner coming home, with the intrusion of pets and neighbors and the noise around them. And we understand the multi-layeredness of their lives and the fact that they can't just give all their resources into becoming the scholar. They are multiple human beings. Sorry, I need to rush. So we need to bring the body back in. The body tires, it breaks, it has different abilities, but it also needs to be celebrated. And I'm very fortunate that my office is just above the steps in the Senate Hall, where I can see the graduation and I can see families and students celebrating the body that eventually mastered a degree. So one also needs to bring back relational thinking. I think we need to be deeply bothered as lecturers, as people who train emergent researchers, to find out whether our trainee researchers' journey into their own knowledge making is ever evolving, joyous, and an endless adventure for them. And I draw on the ideas of False Borda, who says that erasing the abyssal line means reconnecting to hope and allowing for feeling thinkers to thrive. Quickly, IKS, andragogy. I think a lot of our lectures were only about value clarification, where we sat down, students and lecturers, alongside and learned from one another what is knowledge creation and what is their own values. And I think what it calls for is constant advocacy, that students are not the troublesome others, but actually the human same, that they're the most important part of the human whole that we purport to be in service of. Zavala tells us that if we use IKS as the marker for research training, we would look at whether we were able to build relationships and allow for inclusive and diverse ways of knowing. In conclusion, I would say that what I've learned from my students are that we need to build deeply reciprocal relationships in the research and research training arena, and always ask the so what questions. Whom does this serve? What does it legitimize, authorize, include, change, and move towards? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gretchen, for that stirring and I think important. Thank you for bringing us into your world and, you know, on navigating those tensions between, as you said, teaching and nurturing what you called an epistemic disobedience. I will open up for questions, comments, one or two.
Thank you very much, Prof. Christian, and thanks for challenging us. When you were speaking, I was just thinking about our Research Ethics Committee and also our research ethics forms and compliance. And when do we build these students who become exploratory and disobedient and creative? And the issue is we say, okay, let's remove the forms. But if we have not decolonized the reviewers, we're still going to set student for fail. So I think this might be the debate which will need to be continued further.
Any other last comments or questions? If there aren't any, we will move on to our last presenter. I am aware that we have reached 4 o'clock and that it should be the end of the program. But can I please ask you just for 15 minutes of your time to just accommodate our last presenter? Thank you. You can come up. We have now Shoaib Ahmed, and he will be speaking to us about comparative analysis of indigenous knowledge systems and Islamic educational practices, traditional methods, language, and oral traditions.
Okay, good day everyone, or good afternoon. While sitting here and listening to the previous few speakers and yesterday, somehow I've decided to adjust my presentation a little, so bear with me if it sounds a bit unorganized at some point, because I was benefiting from some of the arguments and some of the statements, so I decided I need to incorporate some of the things that some of the speakers have been saying. So I'm speaking about a comparative analysis between an indigenous knowledge system and an Islamic knowledge system, but my specific focus is one region, and that's in Africa. Remember, in Africa we have many societies, each are unique, but there are similarities. But we cannot focus on the entire continent, and I chose one specific area, and that is the area of a country called Mauritania. And very soon, as we go along in this presentation, you'll understand why I chose Mauritania and what is so significant about it. Now, by way of introduction or just a few opening sort of remarks, one or two interesting comments that I came across was one by J.K. Zerbo. He says, when an old man dies in Africa, a library is gone. A library disappears. Now that's a very important statement, and you'll see why it's even more important in the Mauritanian context as well. Right? And then we look at that, when I speak about indigenous knowledge systems across Africa, there's multiple systems. But we need to expose our students to these multiple systems, because we live in a global village which is fast changing all the time. We cannot just restrict them to one system. We need to expose them to all of these systems, but when they are exposed to all of these systems, we must motivate them towards wanting to change, to make a difference. And that starts, we heard about decolonization, and decolonization is not simply a theory. It's not a bunch of theories. It must propel us towards action, because we need to become knowledge producers and not consumers. And that's what we're going to see as we go along. When I speak about indigenous knowledge systems, my concern throughout my research is about how the knowledge was preserved and how it's transmitted, how it's passed on. How the indigenous knowledge system in these various communities, more so in Mauritania, how is it passed on? Now we'll see in a country, or let's take first general, indigenous knowledge general, we'll find there's something called epistemic plurality. Now, how do we, when I say we, as an indigenous society, a society in Africa, how do we stem our own epistemology when it's not even recognized? Now, when I say this, I'm going back to Mauritania. I'm using this as an example. And the reason why I chose Mauritania, shortly I'll explain that. When the colonialists the French had entered Mauritania and colonized that nation, they met scholars, Mauritanian scholars who had authored as much as 100 books in geography, in maths, in grammar, in poetry. One man authored 100 books, but they had his passport stamped as illiterate because he could not read and write French, because he could only speak their local language. So he was regarded and considered illiterate because he only spoke Arabic. Right? So that is something that we need to keep in mind. So going on, in terms of how the knowledge is preserved and passed on, if you look back at ancient Egypt, etc., and across the continent, you will find that there were drawings, there were paintings, there were on the walls inscriptions. It was an oral transmission that took place, by and large, singing, dance, etc. There was all of this that was taking place. So it was performative. People performed certain actions, and that's how children observed, and they passed on, that particular knowledge was passed on by simply observing. Certain rituals were carried out at certain days when a child is born or when weddings took place, and people observed. So performative transmission of knowledge that took place through social norms, even cooking. It wasn't just simply an action, okay, I need to feed myself, I need to eat, and that's it. Cooking certain foods at certain times, at certain days, when on a funeral a certain food was cooked. There's a reason for that. At certain days of the year, certain foods were cooked. The utensils also differed from time to time. All of that was a reason. It wasn't just done because we couldn't find anything better to use, or I'd use this particular utensil. So everything had a reason, everything had a purpose, and that's what they passed on generation, like without having to formally sit in a classroom or something, but knowledge was transmitted. And if you look back at indigenous knowledge systems, you'll find that it was generally service orientated. There was always some way which we can serve our community. It had a strong social dimension towards it. Right? This thing was a bit stuck here. All right, we'll come back to some of that. A social transmission, or rather it was experiential, practical, and community-based. Indigenous knowledge was always community-based. It evolved around, the community was involved in all of that process. We find people were storytelling was common. It wasn't entertainment. There was a reason for that storytelling. It passed on certain values. It passed on certain goals that they wished to impart to the children. Games, even the game that a child played, whether it was playing with a spear, whether it was playing with a bow and arrow, whether it was playing that, there were certain higher objectives that were intended. The child was intended that he learn certain skills which would be of benefit to his community. Even agriculture, even fishing, even whatever it was, all of this was intended to pass down certain values, certain norms, certain knowledge practices, etc. So in essence, if we look at the indigenous knowledge, it was education for life. It enabled the person to live in his society. There was no formal examination. What was the examination? If you can lead your life in society as a human being and effectively, then you've succeeded. There was no passing or failing as such. Yes, you made mistakes. The adults in the community sort of monitored it, and they corrected you whenever you made a mistake. So that was, we'd say, in inverted commas, an examination. So it's a community-based kind of education, which had a strong focus on values and morals and spirituality. Indigenous knowledge focused a lot on morals, values, and spirituality. So it was dynamic, but it adapted. It considered the natural surroundings. So this is just quickly, very brief on indigenous knowledge. Now, I said I'm going to speak about Mauritania, and why in particular Mauritania, and then the comparison with Islamic knowledge systems. So putting that background, or this initial few comments that I made regarding indigenous knowledge systems, if you look at an Islamic knowledge system, it's very similar. Slight variation, and what is it? Number one, knowledge, the approach to knowledge in an Islamic system is that ultimately all knowledge comes from God. And it's meant to do two things. One, to regulate a human being's relationship with his creator, and to regulate his relationship with fellow human beings. That's it. That's why you have knowledge. It must regulate your relationship with your creator and with your creation. But now when you deal with creation, knowledge that's of no benefit, that's going to harm creation, should be avoided. That's called dangerous knowledge. Stay away from it. It's of no benefit. Why promote such knowledge? It was also by and large an oral system. Islamic knowledge was passed down greatly through an oral system. An oral system which, you'll see an Arabic word which I may have mentioned somewhere, called the isnad, or it's called the chain of transmission. So what is this? Someone passes knowledge as a teacher, he passes knowledge orally to his student, and that student retains it, memorizes it, and passes it on later on to the next generation. That has been preserved over 1400 years. And now, in order to ensure that that knowledge is valid and it's not distorted in any way, every person passing down the knowledge, they have documented his integrity, his character, his personality, his ability to retain. If he makes mistakes, etc., he's considered an unreliable transmitter of knowledge. So the oral transmission now, because it was oral, we had to know the person's background. You had to know everything about him. You had to memorize when he was born, when he passed on, who his teachers were, and that made him a reliable transmitter of knowledge. And this started from a young age. Children from as young as 4 and 5 years old were transmitters of knowledge. So I, as an adult, could sit and receive knowledge from a 5-year-old, because he is one of those people included in that line of transmission. He received it from his grandfather. He received it from his father. Now he's authorized to transmit knowledge. Now that was the Islamic system in brief. Now we come to the Mauritanian system, which is unique. It's a blend, an integration of the two systems, an indigenous system and an Islamic system almost put together, and we find some amazing results. Now you may wonder, why did, out of all places in Africa, why did I choose Mauritania? Some years ago, you may recall, the former President Thabo Mbeki was quite interested and involved in the Timbuktu project of preserving manuscripts in Timbuktu. And South African government was involved. So I went scratching a bit there, and I found that Timbuktu was inspired by Mauritania. And Mauritania today has something like 36,000 manuscripts, untouched manuscripts. So what contributed to such a thriving scholarly legacy in Mauritania, which we don't know about? The Mauritanians have an exceptionally high level of Arabic, poetry, grammar. They've written hundreds. Children at 12 years old memorized 6,000 lines of Arabic poetry. How does a 12-year-old child memorize 6,000 lines of poetry, etc.? So it made me go into, and some of my own teachers were Mauritanian, so I started questioning them. And then we look at the Mauritanian system, is a system which what we talk about today a lot. It's a system that, it's not a formal system. It's called a mahdara. Children sit under a tree, or they, while the teacher is walking, he teaches them. So you choose the subject, the child chooses the subject, the teacher teaches you the subject you want, at your time, at your pace. But you need to memorize everything. There is no exam, there's no pass, there's no fail. If once the teacher feels you are competent, you move on to the next subject. But you may sit a 7-year-old with a 50-year-old sitting together studying the same subject under the same teacher. There is no discrimination. So you find old men, 60 years old, sitting with 8-year-old boys, and they're studying the same text. They're studying a book in grammar under the same teacher. And there's nobody's ashamed. They're studying. Nobody fails. If it needs, you need to repeat the book thrice, you'll repeat it thrice. And then move on to the next book. So what happens with payment? What happens about discipline? The community, we speak about Ubuntu, we speak about all of this. The community looks after the students. So every house would look after one child, or the more wealthier ones would look after up to 5. So they would feed the child. So what happens to the teacher? The teacher doesn't get paid. He gets a goat end of the month or something, and right, fine, he survives. But the important thing is not that. The important thing is how the knowledge transmitted. Till today, the system exists. This system had accounted for removing illiteracy in Mauritania. Everyone could read and write. Yes, they could read and write Arabic. Women were involved. The education, children write on boards. I say they blend it with their environment. So they take pieces of board. I think there's a picture here which I hope I can show it to you. These slides are not okay. I'll end up with this. Here we go. It's coming soon, I think. All right. 1 second. I don't know why the picture is not showing. All right, never mind. Hopefully it will show you just now. Wooden boards, which they cut from trees. They make a paste using leaves, using milk, using some sand. And the mothers teach them the alphabet. The children write. Once they learn to read and write, the teacher dictates a text, an Arabic text in grammar, or rules of grammar, rules of geography, and they write it on these boards. And then they memorize it. And once they know it, they wash it off. And they write the next few lines. When this child needs to revise, he relies purely on memory. There's no book in front of him. There's no textbook. He has simply memorized it. So they've lived within their environment. They've made use. Remember, it's a desert environment. They don't have much resources, etc. So they've blended the indigenous system, their environment, the Islamic system, and they've produced till today. The Arab world acknowledges that the Mauritanians are specialists in grammar. They're specialists in poetry, but they don't have a decent system. They don't even have bricks. They don't even have electricity, etc. They're studying under a tree. And if I could show you just one of these pictures, and it would make a difference, and I'll end with that. The reason, in conclusion, is simply that we need to expose ourselves to these systems, draw it into our teaching, expose our children to it as well, students as well to it, and enhance our own ability in terms of our language, poetry, and across the board, every other subject, because there's a lot that can be they have to offer to us, but we are not aware of it. So how can we benefit from something which we are not aware of? We need to first be aware of these systems that exist in order to benefit from it. Okay, I'll end with that because I think time is up, but I just hope
outside of the room. So they must show us. Can they show us that picture? It's a picture with kids. Maybe I can just show you from the front. This is the picture.
you'll see one where there's actually a teacher.
Do you want to?
There's the teacher, and there's the children.
Put it over there.
Can we give him another round of applause? Thank you so much for that presentation on the importance or the significance of preserving and I think archiving these intergenerational knowledges, systems, practices and ways of being into our modern educational practices. I will quickly open up for 1 or 2 questions, comments from the room.
Thank you so much. I think it's not so much of a question, but a sense of appreciation. but also immense sadness, as this also really just reminds us of the violence of colonialism. And I think spaces such as this one offer us the opportunity to see the wealth of knowledge and different ways of knowing and being. I feel very emotional just, looking at that and realizing the wealth that actually lies in many of our communities, in many of the cultures, the diversity of cultures. And so I just want to appreciate the work that you're doing, and just say thank you very much. Linking with what you were saying, Gretchen, earlier about how the knowledge is in the body and how with the Euro-Western ways of doing and being, the body has been disregarded. It's about that idea of the rational man. I think, therefore I am. And everything else, what I feel, what I touch, what I see, does not really matter, but it's what I'm thinking, the rationality, and everything else that is perceived to not be rational does not count. And that's what our education system has taught us, has fed us. So even when we're thinking about the training of teachers, where do we begin in infusing and bringing all of this in? It's always thinking about what's lacking, what's the problem. We have 11 official languages. How will we teach them, right? How is that even feasible? But if we understand the importance of the ecologies of knowledges, that actually there is wealth in this multiplicity, that if a student comes from Venda or they come from the Northwest, what they bring in is actually contributing towards what we can learn. And it's because, again, of what we're talking about, that we're thinking about how do we examine that, though? How are we going to set exams? Because we want to look at the individualistic way. How do we determine that that little child has grasped something? So it's always about the system first and not about the human being first. And it's about feeding that system. And I think with the work that you're doing, you're really just reminding us, and I hope that we're all encouraged in really realizing the possibility and the wealth and the richness of IKS. So thank you so much.
Just 2 comments. Yeah, the first is even this particular system you see in Mauritania, it wasn't left by the colonialists. Once they colonized the country, they tried to enforce French, and then they left. The country obtained its independence, and then they tried to impose the French schools. So if you only were a graduate from a French school, you were given a job. If you came from a traditional school like this, you were not given a job. But it carried on for a while until the 1900s. The French and some Germans realized that there's a wealth of knowledge in the country in terms of the manuscripts. So 2 French women, or German women, I think one of them, was spent a year in Mauritania documenting all the titles of the manuscripts. So the biggest index of the manuscripts is actually done by some Europeans as well, which we were not involved in, documenting and recording the title, simply title, subject, and the author's name. And it went, that's where how we know there are 36,000 manuscripts that are untouched. Many of it is lying in trunks because the father or grandfather was a scholar and he's passed on. So the children are not too interested. So it's lying there neglected, and knowledge, books on geography, history, grammar, poetry, whatever the case may be, is lying. Now the government's trying to index it and trying to preserve some of it in the last few years. It's a costly exercise. That's the one. And I often tell people when you start moving across Africa, and I asked someone, I think at UNISA, the conference there on learning and teaching, and the opening remark I said was, I just asked the crowd, what's the oldest university in the world? And someone said Bologna, or someone said this. I said the oldest university is Qarawiyyin in Morocco. The second oldest is Al-Azhar in Cairo. The third oldest is Tunis, Kairouan. The 3 oldest universities, and then Timbuktu comes. So the 3 oldest is actually in Africa, but how many of us know? How many of us teach that in the schools? How many do we know what they taught? How did the systems, it's 1,000 years old, Qarawiyyin in Morocco. It's 1,100 years old at the moment, and it's still functioning. The university still functions, and it was established by a woman. It was established by a woman, and that university still functions, but do we know that? Have we visited there? Have we bothered to even interact with scholars there? So those are things that we need to take it, not simply a fact in history, but now build beyond that and take it further. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for your patience, and thank you for those astute contributions and engagements. I think we can give another round of applause to all our presenters. Thank you so much for your contributions from your respective contexts and disciplines. It was really moving, really interesting. Thank you all.